This is the talk we're doing today. The speakers are LUBA ELLIOTT, who's an AI curator and researcher, presents AI art to recent history 2015 to 23 to now. That should be really interesting. LUBA's been working in this area and doing shows with the new generation of AI artists. Anna Ridler's quite a famous artist, used machine learning to create Myriad, which was the Tulips piece, and Mosaic Virus, 2 pieces, which are quite well known. Mark Webster does a lot of art and sound work, generative art. He's worked a lot with natural language processing, or NLP, using the IBM system, which I've used a lot, for sentiment analysis, and he's going to comment on some of his work. And then Patrick LICHTY is presenting his new work, which is a AI exhibition, Studio Visits, in the Post-Human Atelier. Now, Patrick's got a big history. He started with net art and mixed media art, and was in the Yes Men editor of magazines and so on. So now I move on to my very brief talk. So now this statement came out this week, and I thought I'd better mention it because it's in the news. It was on the newsstands yesterday, a headline, you know, we're all going to die, basically. The ethics of AI is a large and complex area. The speakers might have something to say about it through their artwork, you know, which people do these days, especially the newer artists working in a more social way. Well, they might not, of course, since it's not an obligation for artists to have ethical attitudes unless they're applying for grants. So, you know, there's always that an artist is supposed to be free of these constraints. Now, this statement was from the Centre for AI Safety, who got them and a bunch of AI experts and presidents of various things, you know, made this statement. They didn't put much detailing because they wanted it to be simple and to the point. Now, this is a really good idea, obviously, but you know, these fears have been around for a while. This book's 2014, that's 10 years ago, almost, Superintelligence. This is a good one to read if you want to get up to date with the, you know, what's being talked about now, really. But nobody took any notice of this, particularly until now. I mean, there were arguments about bias and so on. So there has been a debate, but it's been more in the industry than outside the industry, whereas now it's all gone mainstream public. Now then, a quick one, artificial posture. Perhaps the biggest immediate threat from AI will be postural, as it promotes even more desk-bound computer or smartphone work, leading to an increase in back and neck aches, eye strain, headaches, repetitive strain injury. David Byrne, who's in the band Talking Heads and writes on music and culture, has commented that all recent technologies from recording music, especially in his case, obviously, and AI now, eliminates humans and makes people more isolated. This is a good point. So the health aspect in like physical and mental health is quite important with the growth of these isolating technologies. Rather than the kind of Terminator myth we have. Most of the responses to it have been very positive. I mean, I'm an AI researcher, and I've been researching on how creatives use AI. The reaction we get from creatives using generators, text generators or image generators for the first time, joy is that they're most, I mean, in the words of their comments, they say joy, it's amazing. And then you do a sentiment analysis on all of the comments, and the sentiment joy comes up as the highest scoring term. Now, we had these results from the studies. We had 82 writers using AI, most of them for the first time. This was a couple of years ago. And they were amazed. They couldn't believe how much fun it was. And the same applies to the image generators that are around now. People just really like using them, which is why the take-up has been so great, so rapid. Generative art's not the same as AI art. They often get mixed up. Generative art uses computer programs to produce repetitive variations, usually to make abstract images or sequences. You have people like Zancan now who does more artistic looking images, but they're still created abstractly from algorithms. Whereas AI programs attempt to formulate output that mimics human responses, as in games, robot painting systems, get onto that later, and modern image and text generators. Okay, now the next slide. This is a fun one. We've got Harold Cohen, who gets a mention again. This is in the 70s. He had an AI system, which was an expert system he'd coded to be like himself. And it would draw on using a turtle, which is a kind of small robot that drew on the floor on a piece of giant paper on the floor, so you get an outline, and then he'd fill them in. So you can see in this picture, you can see the outline, and then he'd go and fill them in. And I think later versions had color as well. But it's now the other one on the right is ADAR, the art robot. It's got a chrome hand with a brush painting mechanism, which you can see in this picture. This art robot is ignored by the fine art and academic communities, but it's a well-known popular art figure. So I thought I'd mention it because, you know, it gets in the press. It's like a publicly known AI artist. It's presented as an android, but it's not really. It's just a drawing machine that's kind of dressed up. It does a bit of speaking, but I'm not convinced by that. But last month in the Design Museum in London, which is a really big institutional kind of place, it was on for a 3-day show in a really big auditorium. Huge crowds arrived to watch the robot, you know, Ada, do her painting. Produced, I think, only one painting a day. It's quite a slow process with this big funny arm. And also she gave a talk at the House of Lords in Britain on AI and art, which is, you know, kind of interesting. And also she was arrested in Egypt when they went there for a tour, which I thought was hilarious. And apparently they thought she was some kind of spying device. So they just stuck her in a cell for a while. So she gets to places that AI art doesn't normally get to, including the public consciousness, really. So I think she's worth a mention, even though she's a bit weird in a lot of ways. And there's a big debate about whether you should have these anthropomorphic robots, you know, especially pretending to be women and pretending to be, you know, attractive artists and all that. There's something a bit funny about it. But anyway, moving swiftly on. We've got AI art tools. Now, I use Photoshop a lot, so I've got the Adobe suite, but obviously there's alternatives to Adobe. Now, there's all sorts of new plugins in Photoshop. So it's going even more mainstream now into design and into general production. So generative tools are in, and generative editing tools are in these programs, the paint programs now. I mean, we were talking about Quantel. That was a kind of simple paint program that did a huge amount of new work when it came out, photo editing and so on. So things have moved on quite a bit. The other thing to mention about all these tools is that these art generators are more or less free for most people. Or you can pay a few pounds and you get sort of much more use of them. But I remember when certainly music and art software cost, you know, hundreds of pounds to get one program. So another reason for the rapid take-up is that they're so cheap or free. Image generation development accelerated from last year. The field has gone from half working systems, which we've been looking at for a few years now, to similar to human level production. AI computer art from a year or two ago is experimental, and all those blobs and psychedelic effects that we've been looking at for a while are from transitional systems. So from like nothing to now, there was all this period of a few years where there was a lot of quite interesting work being done with, you know, because artists are experimental, they prefer it like that anyway. These generators enable people with artistic urges or requirements for presentation graphics, say, but no training to produce images of whatever takes their fancy. They're very useful for presentation and illustrations, as I've used them in these slides. The difficulty for an artist is the tremendous overproduction of images, and this is a feature of AI. You know, it can make one thing, but it can make a million things. So how do you decide? So that creates choice anxiety and befuddlement. You know, it's just too much. The way to avoid choice anxiety is not to be a perfectionist and live with uncertainty, which is difficult for an artist. If you're working on something and then you're presented with, you know, a huge amount of possibilities, it's maybe like the opposite of what you want. So this set I've got here, now I did something called Micro Arts Group years ago. And if you put in micro arts into Google, you get lots of people making tiny things, making sculptures inside the eye of a needle, and this type of activity, you know, which would definitely give you bad eyes. But so if I did a generation on micro arts, and it came up with a mixture of monitors with things going on inside them. So you've got group activities, smallness, and like computer monitors. So that's quite a good one. And the one on the right is some abstract stuff I'm working on now, which is more like drawn or repetitive drawn generative graphics, which is a really interesting area to use them to create what you use a plotter or a drawing device to make. In the old, before they could just do it for you. And of course, they're only making the output, not the process. But so they're lots of fun, really. They do open up the possibility for more diverse art production. There's this thing, outsider or naive art, which is obviously not in the mainstream gallery system, but there's an awful lot of it around, an awful lot of amateur artists who would like to use these kind of things and maybe explore aspects of what they're working on. And also it creates a community and people communicate with each other. So there's a big online scene now for this type of work. It's this origin and separation of AI art from more traditional artists and the art world. So it's kind of a separate area. People later will talk about this a lot, but there is a separation of this mainstream image generator work from the traditional gallery system. So this puts it in a slightly ambiguous position. Some call for AI art to be a separate art category and have separate exhibitions for AI art. And other people think it would just become integrated in the way that it already has with tools in Photoshop and so on. But this is a whole area that we're talking about. So we'll be discussing it through the artists and through the discussion. And it's all very new as well, and nobody really knows how it's going to work out. Okay, the other thing I was going to mention, which we don't really have the time for, is found art, because a generator is working within a huge data space of images of all sorts, photographic, art, medical, anything you can think of. So it will produce from that data set. So that could be, you could use that as to create a kind of found art rather than know what you want with a descriptive prompt. You could go off investigating the data space. So I won't go on about that much. Okay, so now it's already time's moved on. So I think we need to go on to LUBA. AI curator and researcher is going to present AI art, a recent history, 2015 to 2023, which should be really interesting. So I'm looking forward.
And yes, I'm going to give a quick overview of AI art from 2015 to kind of the present day, because these are the kind of the times I've been active in the field, and also kind of this recent generation of which Anna Ridler, Jake Elves, Mario Klingemann are all part of. And just to start off with, I'll just mention a couple of projects about kind of the perspective I'm coming from. So I started by running a meetup in London that was kind of connecting the technical research community and also artists working with these tools. And that led to a number of different projects. So curating a media art festival, then putting up exhibitions at business conferences, and also the NeurIPS creativity workshop, which is probably one of the projects I'm kind of best known for. And so this was a workshop on creative AI at this really big and important academic AI conference. And alongside that, I also curated an art gallery, which kind of still exists online, so from 2017 to 2020. And now I think the workshop is still being continued, and it's run by Tom White, who is an artist from New Zealand. So if you're interested, you can still kind of submit and pay attention to that. And I also kind of run I curate the Art and AI Festival in Leicester, where we try and put some of this art in the public spaces around the city. And I've also done a little bit of kind of NFTs, like I think many AI artists do now. So exhibition at Ferrophile and at Unit Gallery. And so now I'll start kind of my presentation, and I normally started with Deep Dream, so a technology that came out of Google in 2015, where you had, let's say, an image, and then kind of the algorithm looked at it and it got excited by certain features, so you got all the crazy colors and crazy shapes. And that really was one of the first things that I think excited the mainstream about kind of AI and its developments. And to me, it's still one of my kind of favorite projects in a way, because I do find it quite creative and I quite like the aesthetic. But there are very few artists who've been working with it. And Daniel Ambrosi is probably the one example who's kind of stayed with the technology. And yeah, so he normally does lots of landscape artworks where you can kind of see the deep dream aesthetic, but also the subject matter, which I think is good, because a lot of artists sort of let the aesthetic take away everything from kind of the image. So it was all about the aesthetic, but here you can also see the subject matter. And recently he's also sort of experimented a bit with kind of cubism and tiling, some of this to kind of freshen up his approach. And yeah, then came something called style transfer, which is when you had an image and you could switch it into the style of Monet, Van Gogh, or one of these impressionist artists. And again, there's a lot of the AI researchers and software engineers were really excited about it, because to them, that's what art should be like, right? It's something you find in an old museum. And I think a lot of the artists or art historians I met were like horrified, because of course artists nowadays are trying to kind of make something new, either in terms of aesthetic or in terms of the comment on society. So yeah, there are kind of, it's tricky to find interesting projects there, I think, unless you kind of broaden the definition of style to something beyond artistic style. And this is just an example of Gene Kogan, kind of a key artist and educator in the field, doing some kind of yeah, different variations of Mona Lisa in Google Maps, calligraphy, and kind of astronomy-based style. And then came something called the GAN, which I think was kind of one of the more popular tools of this generation of artists. And it came out in 2014, and then there were lots of kind of different versions of it, because it was a very active research topic until, you know, by I think it was like 2018 or 19, it began making like very kind of photorealistic images. And I think some of my favorite works are still from the early periods of the GAN. So Mario Klingemann has been doing amazing work kind of looking at the human form, and a lot of these images were sort of compared to Francis Bacon. And what I like about them is that sometimes they can still show some of the features of the earlier GANs. So sometimes there's kind of the wrong placement of facial features, or like you can see in the image in the middle, the arm is at an odd angle. So still kind of some of the glitches and the errors of the technology that are sort of made use of in the artistic work. And I really like that. And when the GANs became very realistic, artists needed to kind of think a lot more about what they would do with their work, because they could no longer rely completely on those kind of glitches. And Scott Eaton is an example of an artist who kind of really studies the human form, and he's able to come up with these kind of images that sort of combine the realistic textures with maybe slightly odd shapes that are familiar to everyone who has been following the development of the GAN. And yeah, Mario Klingemann was also kind of experimenting. So this is a work from the show I curated for UNIT earlier this year. And there were two images. So the one on the left is from, I think it's kind of from 2018, from his project called Neural Glitch, where, yeah, he kind of used a neural network to kind of generate, yeah, an image of a face to the standards of that time. And the image on the right was when he used kind of, I think the image on the left is a source image, and then kind of used stable diffusion to come up with something with an image like that. And you can see kind of how different it is in terms of, yeah, the quality is kind of much more realistic and, yeah, quite different to the earlier GAN image. And yeah, artists like Ivona Tao kind of look at machine learning and what that means, because of course in machine learning you kind of train a neural network and it's supposed to kind of improve and produce better results. And she had a project that was doing machine forgetting, so it was kind of the image, I think, quality got worse, as you can maybe kind of see in this image. And yeah, of course, also entangled others. So that's Sophia Crespo and Philip McCormack have been doing some amazing work looking at the natural world and all these kind of insects and sea creatures. And yeah, so this work was done, I think, in the last year or so, where the two artists combined various kind of generations of GAN images to make these kind of creatures that combine different characteristics from different species. And yeah, other artists have also been thinking about kind of how they can also maybe display this work, or what else can they do to kind of make their work interact more with the ecosystem. And Jake Elves, who actually has this work on show now at Gazelle in London. Yeah, so he trained an AI on images of these marsh birds, and then he put up a screen in the Essex marshes. So you can see in the background, there were all these kind of birds that were kind of walking around, and they could interact with the screen with this digital bird. And I think that's sort of very interesting, because yeah, you have these like two species kind of next to each other, and how do they kind of deal with a robotic or with this fake image. And yeah, so moving on to kind of sculpture, Ben Snell did this lovely project called Dio, where he trained an AI in various designs of kind of sculpture from antiquity to modern times. And then he proceeded to destroy the computer who made all these designs, and yeah, made the sculpture out of it. And I think conceptually this is kind of much more evolved than a lot of other kind of AI artists, because of course there are probably some parallels to artists from the 20th century who are destroying their work. And yeah, I think it's a really nice piece. And yeah, next up, there's also a group of artists who really think a lot about kind of the data set. And Roman Lipsky is, so he did this project quite a long time ago now, but I find it interesting because he's been working with sort of like realistic landscapes. He's been painting a lot, so kind of not really working with the digital realm. And then he took this photograph, made 9 different paintings of it, worked with some technologists who trained an AI to kind of generate an image based on these ones. And yeah, this is kind of what he got from the AI. And he proceeded to paint different kind of versions in response. And you could kind of see how his style evolved as kind of he kept feeding his works into the machine and receiving a response. And I think this is kind of his final image. So if you look at the two side by side, you can see how by working together with an AI system, he was able to really evolve his style, both in terms of, I think, how he depicts the subject matter. So it became a lot more abstract, and also the color scheme. So it became a lot cooler. At certain points, he was kind of experimenting with many more colors. And yeah, he still kind of stayed working in a physical piece. So you could still use some of these tools and continue kind of working physically. So you don't always need to kind of rely on the purely generated image. You could still do kind of things in paint or engraving and so on. And yeah, Helena Sarin is another artist who is kind of well known for using kind of data sets and having her own aesthetic. And what I really like about her work is that she frequently combines different mediums. Like in the image on the right, she's got, I think, flowers, newspapers, and photography as a texture. So combining all these different mediums and kind of GAN tools, she's able to come out with these images that are very much kind of her own in terms of aesthetic. And then normally I talk about Anna Ridler's Tulip project, which I commissioned for Impact Festival in 2018. But I know that she will be doing that. So I guess I'll just mention that as a curator, what I really appreciate about this project is that Anna made a conscious decision to sort of highlight the human labor that goes into this work. So in kind of in many of her exhibitions, there would be the kind of the generated tulips together with a wall of these flowers. And that sort of really made, I think, a difference in how AI art was being perceived and being presented, because many artists, even if they would try and figure out how to kind of display their work beyond the digital screen, like it wasn't kind of very common to display the data set, and Anna's a real pioneer in that. So yeah, she'll explain that after my presentation. And yeah, moving on to more modern times, when DALL-E and Clip have entered the world. Yeah, of course, I think the artistic and the audience focus have shifted to kind of these text-to-image generators, which is, of course, when you write a text prompt and then get an image out of it. And I think as a curator, I've always struggled to find interesting artworks, because it felt to me that it was almost kind of a completely different medium, because it's so different from a lot of earlier AI art, which was where artists kind of thought a lot more deeply about maybe the technology itself and a lot of the kind of ethical implications on the concept, whereas a lot of the text-to-image generated art feels very kind of just about aesthetics. It's, yeah, the image. So yeah, just including a few projects that I think kind of are more interesting to me as a curator, one of which is Botto, which is made by Mario Klingemann and operates, I think, as a DAO, where there's a community of kind of audience members who vote on which of the images is going to be put up for sale. And I remember this was kind of initiated during the height of the NFT boom. And yeah, I think a few of these images, yeah, sold within a few weeks, fetched over €1 million, which was kind of, yeah, great news for AI art. And yeah, Vadim Epstein is somebody who's been, yeah, he's been working with, I think, these tools quite deeply, particularly Clip, and sort of developing his own aesthetic and then these narrative videos. Yeah, so his work is great. And Maneki Neko is an artist I curated in one of my kind of NFT exhibitions that I did. And what is special about her work is that I think this feels quite different to the stereotypical aesthetic of stable diffusion. So it's quite intricate and yeah, sort of very detailed. And I think kind of she made this work by maybe combining lots of different images together and doing kind of a lot of post processing. But yeah, it's an image that you can tell has a lot of kind of unique style. And yeah, Ganbrud is another artist who's been kind of very successful with text to image generators, and he's been making these kind of epic fantasy related images. And others like Varvara and Mar have kind of applied yeah, the potential of text to image generators to kind of come up with different designs, to print them out and make them into a sculpture. And then, of course, there was also a little bit of kind of controversy, which is probably like ongoing with related to all these text image generators. And Jason Allen got first prize at an art fair in the US. And yeah, I think people were not sure about to the extent that he highlighted the AI involvement, because of course this was kind of an AI generated piece using, yeah, stable diffusion on Midjourney. And I think to anybody who follows AI art made using those tools, it's very obvious that it's something kind of made with one of them, because the aesthetic is kind of very familiar. And yeah, I remember, yeah, Jason Allen was kind of defending himself, saying that he spent a while kind of perfecting the prompt to kind of get this particular result. But yeah, whether this was kind of clear to the judges is uncertain. And in another photography context, I think this was like the Sony Photo Awards earlier this year, Boris Eldaksen submitted this image, which of course looks much less like it was made with a text-to-image generator. And I think he was also kind of regarded very highly by the judges, but he pulled his piece because he used an AI and he thought that he wanted to make a comment that maybe it's not suitable for these competitions. And yeah, including Jake Els here again, because he has this work called Closed Loop that, yeah, that kind of links, that was made in, I think, in 2017. And there's one neural network that generates images from text and another one that generates text from the image. So it's like a conversation between the two, and in some ways it also helps you realize how much the technology has changed in like 6 or 7 years. But on the other hand, this piece is much more interesting and much kind of more conceptually evolved than kind of what is currently being done, I think, from my perspective. And yeah, let's see what I have next. And I'll just maybe show kind of 1 or 2 projects, because in the interest of time, I'll actually probably finish on this project, which I really like. And it's by 2 artists called Chung-Sum Bak, Kim Young-hung, who are based in North Korea. And I think this is a really cool piece because the artists are using facial recognition in a way that it was kind of never designed for. So they're using in a fine art context. So they worked with the artists who were supposed to paint a portrait together with this facial recognition system. And yeah, as soon as the system recognized the face, they had to do something to stop it being recognized as a face. And so you got these portraits, which some of which look more like portraits than others. But I think the image on the right, it took me a very long time to figure out where there is a portrait there until I realized that it was kind of, it's the face 90 degrees tilted. So yeah, I think it's a really cool example of kind of using a technology outside the most obvious kind of generative image tools to kind of still make work that is kind of within this AI art space. And I think here I will end. And here are my details. If you can find out more about my work on the website or email me with any questions. And now I'll pass over to Geoff or the next speaker.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. That's a really interesting talk. Excellent. So now we'll move swiftly on to Anna. Now, Anna Ridler is a well-known artist, and I've mentioned her already, and also LUBA mentioned her. So Anna, over to you. Are you able to show your slides?
Yes, hopefully I'll be able to share my... It was really interesting hearing both of your talks, and especially it's always a pleasure to speak after LUBA, because as she mentioned, we have been working together quite closely for the past 5, 6, 7 years, has it been? And it's been really interesting to see how this space has evolved in that time, and how it's, and especially now with the recent advancements in kind of these diffusion models and the text-to-image models. I'm most well known for my tulip projects, which I will talk about, but I did also want to, which I made using GANs, but I did want to touch on kind of how the field has changed, because now when you talk about AI art, it is kind of, it does now have, I think, like if you go on Twitter or if you go on Discord, it very much is being used to refer to a very particular type of work, which is this kind of text to image work. What I'm showing now is just I had some very kind of quick examples of Dali tulips that I made. I was actually very lucky, and I had I was one of the first people to get access to DALL-E back when it was released, and I found it actually really difficult to make work with, and it's taken me a long time to kind of get my hands into things like Stable Diffusion and DALL-E and Midjourney to make work with, because I find it, the way that it's structured and the way that it's designed, particularly with DALL-E, I found it really, you have no access to kind of the code base, you have no access to the data set, there's no way that you can tinker with it, and you're very reliant on an API, and it's and everything is closed off. So as an artist who's very interested in the tools and the means of production, I found it very difficult to get into and work with. I mean, that is changing. I still think there are conceptually interesting things that you can do with it. There's really interesting research that is coming out around kind of how it relates to memory, how it relates to, and you can do some interesting things around language and ontology. But because for the most part, it's locked away. And even when you're working with Stable Diffusion, I find that, you know, you can't look through all of the data, and it is, you can fine tune it, but you're always going to be working off the base of the kind of like the massive lion data set that for me, it just has, it's been a long time to kind of like get to a place where I think I can do something with it. And that being said, you know, there's so much being kind of like produced every day with it. It does feel like magic when you play with it. I remember the first time I kind of typed something in and got these images out, it did feel so kind of incredible to get it. But it does kind of like, it does raise this real question about kind of, I think, what art is, because not every image is necessarily art. And I think that's kind of a debate that is now going on, because so much is being produced. And there is this question about kind of where does the art sit? And I think for me, the art is very much kind of like how it's then displayed, or the message that it contains, and the experience that someone has through kind of like through interacting with it. So as LUBA mentioned, I'm most well known for my data sets, the work that I do with my data sets, and this isn't something that is just explicitly linked with machine learning. It's kind of something that I've worked with for a much longer period of time. I've always been interested in archives and libraries and data and information, because for me, kind of like every kind of like piece of data, every piece of information is a trace of something that once existed. In many ways, I kind of feel like reconstructing that data or that data set is kind of like a very human thing to do. I mean, I work almost like a detective, kind of building up these kind of like these bits of data to produce kind of an idea or a story, or to use it in my project. I think there are lots of interesting parallels between encyclopedias and dictionaries, and the history of those, with kind of some of the issues around machine learning and data sets that I've explored. This project that I showed in the previous slide, and it's playing now, which was commissioned by the Photographers Gallery, where I essentially created my own ImageNet using Victorian and Edwardian encyclopedias. I think one of the things that's also really important for me, and part of my practice, is showcasing the labor that kind of goes into these projects and the way of working. So it's not just for me kind of like the final output, it's also how I got to that output. And so a lot of the time I will document the process of making, and that kind of documentation will be as equally as important part of the kind of final project as the kind of artifact. That's something that, you know, I come to again and again in my work. Project that LUBA commissioned me to make back in 2017, it was a project that kind of really kind of took off for me, actually, which was about tulips, where I created a piece using a GAN. It was a SynGAN back then, the first one, which I trained on 10,000 images of tulips that I made myself, that I took myself. I didn't make the tulips myself. I was in the Netherlands at the time, working, and one of the kind of reasons why I was really interested in tulips was that I was making a comparison between tulip mania, which was the first known speculative bubble, and Bitcoin, and also the bubble that was going on around AI at the time. So in the GAN piece, which I'll show in a bit, the the GAN is controlled by the price of Bitcoin. And it was a really, really important project for me to do. And I spent a lot of time kind of building this data set. And it's kind of, you have a very different kind of relationship to the data when you're working with it very physically. You know, carrying all of these tulips was very heavy, stripping them was very heavy. And one of the reasons why I stopped at 10,000 tulips wasn't because it's a very nice round number, although it is, it's because tulip season ended. So even though this was a very digital project, it was driven by the rhythms of nature. After I took these, if I can go to the next slide, after I took all of these photographs, I really wanted to display and the data as an artwork in and of itself, which led to a separate piece called Myriad, where I've taken the photographs and shown them with some of the labels that I attached to them, handwritten underneath. And for me, it was part of the way to kind of draw the attention to kind of all of the human decision making that kind of sits somewhere in the chain of kind of AI, because at the time that this was being shown, back in 2018, there wasn't yet that discussion around bias, around how kind of like that human kind of like error can creep into these systems. And so this piece, when it was shown, and you can kind of see on some of them that, you know, you can see my handwriting where I've crossed things out. And the piece, when it's shown, is huge, and it's around 50 square meters. It's only been shown in its entirety twice, because you need quite a large space to put it up in. And I think it also gives people a real sense of kind of the scale of data, because 10,000, when you kind of scroll through on a thumb drive, you don't really understand kind of what that means in the way that you do when your body is physically kind of reacting to it. So it takes a long time to walk by all of these photographs, and you can kind of, you get a sense of how long the kind of like the process of putting it all together was, and the kind of like labor, effort, energy, and all of those things that kind of that sits behind kind of creating a data set. Another kind of reference point that for this project was very much the Dutch still life, that kind of like the golden age Dutch painting that coincided with Chilean. Very heavily referenced in kind of how I composed my data set, which is also another reason why I really like doing things myself. You can't, well, I suppose you can now with kind of like tools like Stable Diffusion and things, but at the time you couldn't kind of like create a data set of kind of, you can kind of Google and ask for 10,000 images of tulips against a black background. And one of the things that I really liked about the kind of further comparison that I liked about kind of like these Dutch still lifes and the way that GANs work is that kind of these paintings, the flowers in them couldn't all exist at once. They're flowers from spring and summer and autumn and winter that are combined. So they're kind of botanical impossibilities, these bouquets, but they're combined using kind of all of the fragments that the artist has got of the flowers that he's seen, sketches and memories and things like that. So rather than kind of copying from nature, paintings are drawing in from the experience of the painter. And for me, that's a really nice parallel to how GANs work. They're not merely copying images from the data set and kind of collaging them together, but kind of creating a botanical, kind of an imagined kind of botanical possibility through the knowledge that it's gained through the data set. So I think there's like that nice parallel that exists there. And the other kind of reference that I like to bring out with this project is the kind of history of floral data sets that kind of sit inside machine learning. This is the iris data set, which is inside scikit-learn. So every time that you're importing that into a piece of code, you're also importing the iris data set. Which was something that was, it was a data set created by Ronald Fisher, which kind of has all this different data about irises. So there is this kind of history, this hidden history inside machine learning of floral data sets, which is also something kind of that I quite like in this project. The kind of final piece, this is a later, kind of made 2 versions of it. This is the 2019 edition that I made after StyleGAN was released. It's a kind of 3-screen installation, and as I mentioned, the tulips are controlled by the price of Bitcoin, becoming more stripy and open as the price goes up. The title references the disease that gives tulips their stripes, which was also made them the most valuable at the height of tulip mania. And it's kind of asking questions around value and around notions of value and kind of like speculation and collapsing these 2 different moments in history. And what I also really enjoyed about this project, because it is a very complicated project, was that through working with the dataset and with the GAN, I was able to kind of like explore very different kind of things in each part of it. So the dataset piece was much more explicitly about machine learning and about kind of the issues and kind of ethics that maybe sit inside of it, whereas the GAN piece was much more talking about something not really related to the technology and about kind of like wider questions around value and notions of kind of like speculation, as I said. And it's a work that still kind of gets exhibited quite regularly in a variety of different institutions and kind of cultural spaces, everywhere from kind of like public, it was on kind of like buses in a town in Germany, just as a very like pretty moving image piece, through to kind of critical kind of overviews as to where photography is going in different museums. And then, because I know we don't have a massive amount of time, I just wanted to end with something that I often end kind of talks that I do, where I often kind of like am asked about where I see kind of like AI art sitting. And I can only answer for myself because I'm not a curator, but I find that I look back into history to kind of see where kind of like it might go, and the kind of I find it hard to kind of connect to some of like the early algorithmic artists, but I find it very easy to kind of see the parallels between my practice and land and environmental artists, and I often look to them for inspiration, because land and environmental art is so much about planning. It's so much about thinking through kind of like all the various different possibilities, and then allowing something that you can kind of predict but you can never control to then act on that planning. And for me, that's the same as kind of spending all of this time building my data set, all of this time kind of like constructing kind of like a model, and then kind of like press and go, and then allowing something to come out of it. And then also kind of like there is this question about kind of where the art sits, and in land and environmental artists, a lot of it is in the documentation. I think for AI artists, it's also the documentation. It's not necessarily kind of like the model as it runs, or kind of like the insides of what's going on. It's the images, it's the sound, it's the kind of performance that comes out of it. And so, yeah, that's kind of like where I wanted to end it, and this kind of and how even kind of like now I'm still amazed at the possibilities that this technology can offer, and how inspirational I find it on a daily basis. And I think I'm to time.
Hey, that's great, Anna. That's really interesting. That's an excellent talk, because I've seen your work and it is very impressive in real life. So yeah, very good. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to Mark Webster.
Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful. Okay, just a quick introduction. So my name is Mark Webster. I'm an artist based out in Brittany, a lovely part of France. I've been working with generative systems, computational generative art since 2005. And it's only recently, though, that I've started to work on a kind of a personal body of work. And one of those projects that I've worked on is Hypertype, which is the project I'd like to talk to you about this evening. So in a nutshell, Hypertype is a generative art piece that uses emotion and sentiment analysis as its main content. So I'm pulling in data using a specific technology, and that data is used as content to organize typographic form as letters and symbols. So it's first and foremost a textual piece. And secondly, it's trying to draw attention to a specific field in AI, a specific technology, which is called natural language processing or understanding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ideas that came to develop Hypertype. What you're actually seeing on the screen at the moment is two images that are from the program that were exhibited in London last year in November. So just to talk a little bit about where this all came from, this project. A few years back now, I came across this technology. So it's by IBM. It's an API, natural language understanding, and it enables you, basically what this technology does is it enables you to give it a text, and it will analyze this text in various ways. And there was one particular part of the API that interested me, was the analysis, the emotional and sentiment analysis part. So what it does is you give it a text, and it basically spits out kind of keywords. And so these keywords are relevant words within the text, and it will assign a sentiment score. So something that is positive, negative, or neutral to these keywords. It also assigns an emotion score, and based on 5 basic emotions. So these 5 basic emotions are joy, sadness, fear, disgust, and anger. So yeah, I came across this technology quite a few years ago, and I became kind of fascinated by it. I wanted to learn a little bit more. So to do that, I did a lot of reading, and I also wrote a few programs to try and explore what I could do with this technology, just to try and understand it, and without thinking about doing anything artistic to begin with. So what you're seeing on the screen here is on the left, you have basically just a shoot screen of some data. So this is a JSON file. This is typically the kind of data that you get out of the API. So I'm just underlying the keyword. This is one keyword, which is a person. So it's Douglas Hofstadter, a very well-known philosopher in the world of AI. And as you can see, there are 5 emotions with a score that go from 0 to 1 that are given to Douglas. And there's a sentiment score, it's neutral. On the right, what you're seeing is probably something that you've seen before. This is a different technology, but it's very much linked with textual analysis. What you're seeing on the right is facial recognition technology. And in fact, you are seeing as well the photo of the face of a certain Paul Ekman. Now, Paul Ekman is quite famous because he was, along with his team, one of the people in the 60s to kind of bring up this theory that emotions are universal, they can be measured, and they can be dissected. And this was a theory that was used in part to develop, facial recognition, emotion recognition, but also textual. So as I said, I kind of, as I learned about this technology, I wrote a lot of programs. What I have here is a shoot screen of an application that I wrote in Java, basically enabling me to kind of visualize the data. Very simple. Actually, what you're seeing is an article on Paul Ekman's research, which is quite funny. On the right, you can see that there are a list of keywords, and for each keyword, there is a sentiment score. And on the left, there's a little graphic, and there's the general sentiment score. And then I can go in through the list of each keyword, and I can see kind of information about the various 5 emotions. So there's a score for each emotion: joy, sadness, disgust, anger, and fear. So, you know, I built quite a few programs. I also made a little Twitter bot that enabled me to kind of, because you can get so much data from this technology, it was really important for me to kind of get an understanding of how it not just worked, but what it was giving back. So I wrote a little Twitter bot that basically would take an article from The Guardian every morning, and then it would analyze this, and it would publish the results on Twitter. And this just enabled me to kind of, you know, observe things. But at the end of the day, at some point, you know, there was the burning question about, well, how does this actual technology work? How does a computer go about labeling text with an emotion? And so I went off and I did a lot of reading about this, not just kind of general articles in the press, but I tried to, you know, to learn about it technically, and I came across a lot of academic articles. Now, I'm not a computational linguist, and very quickly, you know, I came across things that were very, very technical, but something else very different happened, and it was quite interesting. While I was trying to learn about the technical side, about how this computer was labeling text with emotion, another question came about, which was, well, what is an emotion? You know, what is a human emotion? And that was really interesting, because at the time I was reading a lot of Oliver Sacks. You may have heard of Oliver Sacks. He's written a lot of books. He was a neuroscientist, and although he never really touched upon emotion, his books kind of opened up a door, and I started to read and learn about other people who were working in the field of neurobiology. And there were a few people. So there was Antonio Damasio, and there was Robert Sapolsky. 2 people who are very well known in the field of neurobiology and touching on questions, not just emotion, but also consciousness. And a lot of their texts can be quite technical, yet they were very, very interesting. And then there was another person that came along, which I'll show the cover of, a certain Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, also based out in the States, who's doing wonderful research and written a number of books. One of them here called How Emotions Are Made. Now, it was really with Lisa Feldman Barrett's book that something kind of clicked, because in it, she started to talk about Paul Ekman. And she in a way, she kind of really pulled his whole theory apart. Now, Dr. Barrett is doing a lot of research in this field. So she's working in a lab and she's doing contemporary research. What she says in the book really kind of debunks the whole theory of Paul Ekman. That is to say that, you know, human emotions are not universal, that they are not innate. We're not born with them. And this very interesting quote that I put here: emotions are not reactions to the world, but rather they are constructions. So her whole theory kind of drives towards this idea that, in fact, emotions are concepts, and the things that we kind of we do on the fly in terms of our context, in terms of our experience. and in terms of also our cultures. And so this was really kind of an eye-opener for me. And it also, in a way, kind of made me think, well, again, how does a computer label words and try and infer any kind of emotional content from that? And from what I was reading from these people, Lisa Feldman-Barrett, Antonio Damasio, Robert Sapolsky. And by the way, Antonio Damasio and Robert Sapolsky, they added the whole kind of body side to things. You know, we tend to think that everything is in the brain, but emotions, our experiences are very much a bodily experience. And so at the end of the day, I kind of made up this, not made up, I basically came up with the conclusion that, well, you know, a computer is not going to really infer any kind of emotional content from text. So from that point of view, I thought, well, it's an interesting technology, and it'd be nice to do something artistic with it. So how am I going to go about this? So that was the next stage. I did all this kind of research, and I basically came to the conclusion that the data is there. There's lots of data. How do I use it? Let's use it as a sculptor might use clay, or a painter will use, you know, paint. I mean, it just let's use that data to do something artistic with. And at the time, I actually didn't do anything visual. I did actually do a sound piece to begin with, which was published back in 2020, called The Drone Machine. And this particular project was pulling in data from IBM, emotion data analysis, and using that to drive a generative sound oscillators. I basically built a custom-made synthesizer, digital synthesizer, that was bringing in this data, and it was generating sound. And this, I can share the project perhaps later on with a link. It was published and went out on the radio. It's 30 minutes long, so I'm not going to play it here. So, but just this was the first project I did. What was interesting is that I chose sound, because I found that sound was a medium that's probably kind of spoke to me more in terms of emotion. But the next stage was indeed to do something visual. And this is where hypertype came along. And again, the idea was not at all to do a visualization. You know, again, the data for me just didn't compute, if I use that word. So for me, the data was purely just a material with which I could just, you know, play with. So here what you're seeing on the screen are just the very first initial kind of prototypes, visual prototypes for hypertype, in which I was just pulling in the data, and I was just, you know, putting it on the screen. There were two basic constraints I gave myself for this project. The first one was that it had to be textual. Okay, that was it. It had to be based on text. So everything is a font. And secondly, the context, that is the content, it should come, that's what I said to myself, it should come from the articles that I read, all the research I'd done about the technology. So those were the two kind of constraints, and from there I basically started to develop. I'll probably pass through a few slides because I'm sure we're running out of time. But here I'm just showing you a number of iterations of the development of the project. So I brought in color, of course. Color was an interesting parameter to play with, because you could probably think that you know, with emotion, that you want to assign a certain color to an emotion or anything, but that again I completely dismissed. In fact, a lot of the color was generated randomly from various palettes that I wrote. Here's a close-up of one of the pieces. Here are some more refined iterations. And for those people who work with kind of generative programs, you get a lot of results. And I think as an artist, what is really, really difficult to do when you're working with a generative piece is to try and find the right balance between something that is, has visual coherency across the whole series, yet has enough variety. And so here, these two images, obviously, there's, they're very, very different. One of them being quite minimal, the other being a little bit more charged. Yet, you notice that, I mean, they have a certain coherency visually. So, as a generative artist, you create a lot of these. I usually print out a lot. I usually create websites where I just list all the images so I can see them. And yeah, and then eventually, yes, there was the exhibition. So for the exhibition, there were 5 pieces that I curated. So 5 pieces I chose from the program. And then the program went live for people to mint in an NFT environment. Again, so these were the last pieces. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, Mark, that was very interesting. Hearing you explain where the hypertype images come from, because obviously you don't really get that when you see the images. You understand the generative, but you don't really know all the work that's gone into it, in a way that Anna commented on how much work she puts into the data sets. And there is a huge amount of work behind, AI art of all types, really, especially the ones where you're curating your own data. So yeah, very, very good. Very interesting. Thank you. So we'll move on to Patrick now. So sorry, we're running a little bit late, but I don't think it's too late. It's still within the bracket, so we should be fine, I think. So yeah. Great. Over to you, Patrick.
I'll get started here, and let's see here. I'll be relatively brief, as I said I had about 10 minutes. So the work in itself could be much. I could go much more in depth. Let's see here. My name is Patrick, and I'm going to talk briefly about this project that I'm doing, which is kind of a curatorial meta-narrative called Studio Visits in the Post-Human Atelier. And so I'm at Creative Digital Media and Mass Communication at Winona State University in the United States. And a lot of my AI work probably hasn't been shown so much in the West, because until 2 years ago, I had spent 6 years in the United Arab Emirates, primarily at Zayed University, the federal university in Abu Dhabi. So I'll just touch on it very briefly. So I have been working in the new media field for about 30 years as an artist, curator, and theorist, and dealing in notions of how media shape our reality. So you can see some of my work earlier here in, I was part of the activist group Artmark, which became the Yes Men, a Second Life performance art group, Second Front, and then some of my tapestry work, and Algrist work. This was my 2015 solo show in New York, Random Internet Cats. And then this is some of my asemic calligraphy that I fed through GANs at, let's see here, Playform.io to try to create a personal Rorschach. I called that particular project Personal Taxonomy. And a lot of other things like here, like my still lives, which were also GAN'd and styled and GAN'd through let's see here, StyleGAN and Playform.io. So I've been doing this for about 3 decades. So so let's just kind of fast forward fairly quickly into the idea of when about middle of last year, I decided to go away from the PyTorch GAN sort of collective training models that I used to do from my calligraphy work and my paintings over at Playform into I was working with Night Cafe for a while, and then I found Midjourney, and at first I was not quite satisfied with things because I was on the Midjourney server and finding people doing pretty tropic sort of work, and then I decided to take two things is that I decided to think of what I was doing as concrete prose with code. And then secondly, I decided to take a contestational aesthetics to it. In other words, I wanted to try to find the things that were not representational in the visuals of a clip-based AI. So I did two things. First, I decided to go away from everything that I heard everybody typing on the other side. So in other words, that was almost sort of like an aesthetics of negation. And then on the other hand, I considered the latent space of the Leon 5 database that Midjourney was using as an abstract space. And in the beginning, I decided conceptually, how do I deal with an abstract space? And so I decided to start querying it with notions of abstract architecture, like Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau, just as a beginning, and Cornell and so on. And so what I wound up doing was this about 12 different series called the Architectures of the Latent Space, that you can see here are quite unusual in the fact that they're still referring a little bit to Schwitter's, but nevertheless they're much more sculptural and much more much flatter. And so these went on for about 12, but this is just kind of beginning of my work in that area. Then next, I started finding what I felt were narratives of absence. So on one hand, I have multiple differences of abstraction. Multiple notions of abstraction. On one hand, I wanted to see what was perhaps transcendent of realism. So say, for example, I started playing around with irreal objects in a photography studio. So this is a simulated photo of a four-dimensional cube, a tesseract, and of course, which isn't supposed to be representational, but I thought it was very interesting that it came up this way and that it was actually glowing, and it was illuminating the space. And so this told me that I was on a path in which I was starting to confuse the translator, and that it was starting to give me things that were in between its sets of parameters, which this is what I was very much interested in. So this is another body of work called the Lacunae. Voids, basically brutalism and empty billboards. I was inspired by a post that Joseph DeLapp put on from Scotland of a blank billboard. And one of the things that I noticed that these systems try to do is that they try to represent something. They try to fill space. If there's a blank space, it tries to put something in it. So it tries to fill space with signifiers. So one of my challenges was then to try to, keep that space open, to create empty spaces. So this resulted in experiments with art studios I dictate, where artists were not present. So, or either the artist had no physical form, which that was kind of the conceptual trigger. These spaces turned out to have multiple forms and had multiple forms and aesthetics, as you can see here. In other words, there was a lot of variation. So I thought, how do I put these things together. I mean, there are multiple ways that I deal with these images. So say, for example, as opposed to Anna, I actually am making large numbers of contact books. In other words, I will have maybe about 400 or 500 in a series, and I'll create a contact book. And this gets away from this idea of, choice anxiety. And so on one hand, I have a book that's ready for publication that, someone can see my entire process and they can see the entire 300, 400, 500 images. But in this case, what I thought was very interesting is that, I wound up going into a bit of reverie around the fantasy of these artists who I'd been looking into into their studios, and they weren't in, or they didn't exist in a physical form. So myself, having worked in criticism, curation, theory, and being an artist, I decided to take these things and create a metastructural scaffold, basically to create a meta-narrative, a curatorial meta-narrative based around this concept of this body of 50 artists, who I have conceptually visited their studio. Think about, theoretical constructs such as, Baudrillard, Benjamin, aspects of absence, and then create a form which was actually, in many ways, it was a catalog, which was kind of in a Baudrillardian sense, but was preceded the exhibition. There's a lot of precedent for this. There's Duchamp and the Boynton Valise, and I've done work like this before, in which I've had exhibitions, in formal spaces, such as an iPod. This is 2009, the iPod and Valise. iPod is Boyd for MediaWorks. So, and then I said, well, why can't I do the same thing with a catalog? Why can't I use the formal constraint of a catalog to discuss, the sociology of AI, some of the social anxieties, and put this into a conceptual framework that is quite powerful beyond its own formal constraints. So another constraint that I have also come upon frequently as a new media curator and artist is that of time. Often a moment in technological art, or or in a form, is often quite ephemeral. So say, for example, I've curated shows on handheld art, screensavers, and so on. And these things, you might have a 3 to 6 month period of time in which these things go through. I mean, actually, in this case, I'm finding that this particular body of work is tied a great deal formally to the Midjourney 4 engine, because Midjourney 5 has a much different representational space. So the thing is that, one thing that's important is, where it's situating itself in society, how it's developing as in a formal sense, and then, is there time to deploy an exhibition? And most times, most institutions are, unless you're dealing with a festival, you're doing about a year out, possibly 2. And of course, every essay that I'm writing now, I'm putting in a disclaimer saying that this is written at such a date, such a year, such a month, and this may be obsolete or dated by the time that you read this. So I think that in the case of something that's developing as quickly as AI, this idea of being aware of the temporal nature of the form itself. So I decided to deploy the catalog first. So let the museum show emerge from this, and create the catalog in Valise. As I said before, I've been creating these contact books, which are kind of reverse catalogs in themselves. Probably I'm almost up to 15. I've only mentioned about 6 or 7 on my Instagram. And but in general, I'm looking at the idea of curation as an artistic scaffold. So, given this project, a curatorial frame structures that narrative, so much more around, metastructural, conceptual ones that, rather than representing the images themselves. So, it's a narrative dealing with the anxieties that society has about AI and culture. So what happens if we finally get rid of those annoying artists and basically replace them with AI as a little bit of as a provocation. So here's the structure of the piece. The overall block is the catalog. There's an essay. We have essay and construction, human. That's my part. There's a name which I imagined from colleagues, and so I'm kind of reimagining in a synthetic lens my community. The studio image, as we can kind of see through the narrative that I've presented, I started finding these empty spaces, and I let myself run through about a couple hundred of them, and I chose the 50 most salient ones. And then I took that image, did a describe, and then also did Midjourney allows you to have a function called /describe. You put in the image, and then it gives you a description of that image. And then I took that along with just a brief discussion of the artist and what they do to GPT-3, and I would get a statement. So here's the form. You have the you have the name. This is the first one I did, Artificium 334J452, kind of along the lines of THX 1138, and it came from this initial image, and then I took these plus a description from Midjourney, put it into GPT-3, and here you say, here I'm as an artist, my work is an expression of my innermost thoughts and emotions. I seek to capture the energy and chaos of the world around me, using both bold brushstrokes and vibrant colors to convey my message. I'll talk about this in a second. So these were basically 52-page spreads. The whole book is about 110 pages, and it fits very much, with a catalog format. So the name, as I said before, these were based on the conceptual frame of the artist I was thinking of, based on the image that was generated. Some of the concerns I saw in in the mass media, and loosely upon those of names of colleagues, family, etc. So in many ways, what I was doing was sort of taking a fantasy and re-envisioning my own community under a synthetic lens. So these images came first when developing across the imagined artists of diversity, identity, species, planet. This is kind of interesting here, is that on one hand, I wasn't necessarily thinking of my of my own ethnographic sphere, because of the fact that I had been working in Arabia, West Asia, Central Asia. I was thinking of dealing with people also from Africa and the subcontinent. So a lot of these people that of my experience figure into this what I'd say this global latent space of imagined artists, not just those of the European space, or even those more specifically of North America. So, and then I expanded this out, to species and to planet, as we'll see in just a moment. So here we have in alien sound artists. You can see this is almost a kind of a cyberpunk looking unit, and some very, very otherworldly art. Studio image, I forget who this is, but almost kind of a New England style look. And then third one is a Persian painter obsessed with color, Zafran Pahlavi, based on my partner Nagina Tasabian, who is currently waiting to come over to America from Tehran. So this is kind of a rough outline. I have a PDF of this. If you want to see it, you can get in touch with me. So here also, I take the name and the framework of the artist practice, and you can see here that this information went into GPT-3 reading statements, which are almost indicative of the usual graduate school art statements. Once again, each of these elements reflects some of the anxieties that are in the popular media. And on one hand, I'm using this as kind of a dull mirror from a almost a visual sociology standpoint. Basically, people like Becker. In addition, this is a draft, but more is just a pro forma approach, to the conceptual aspect of this. This is actually available out on Blurb. It's about $100, and it still needs a couple little revisions. But on one hand, this is something which is from a materialist perspective, and basically inverting a lot of practices in regards to the normal modalities of exhibition, curation, and execution, of a show or an exhibition. So on one hand, I'm thinking also about the usual mechanisms of artistic presentation within an institutional path. So not only is this something that's dealing with AI, but it's using AI to talk about the sociological space, talk about the institutional space in which these works inhabit, and then how these works are disseminated. In other words, on one hand, it's dealing with institutions, capitalism, and digital production. So issues. AI exacerbates, any of the social anxieties about technology. The deluge of images problematizes any cohesive narrative. And I hope that by using this meta narrative through this conceptual frame, I'm basically, being able to focus, some of the social and cultural questions about AI and the future of society and how it affects it to, within a fairly neat package. Design and curatorial fictions provide solutions for cultural spaces, I feel, is that they that typically can't keep up with the speed of technology. And then bespoke artifacts, which I think are kind of problematic in themselves, can remain in place long enough for the institution to adopt them. In other words, if you get something together and get it out there, you can have that in place, take it to institutions, and hopefully then that they can explicate the work. Let's see here, sequels. I've had a lot of people ask me, who are these artists? What's their work actually look like? You can see, excerpts of their work in the studios, but people were asking me, is it to take the conceit one step further, and I'm starting to work on that. The idea of that, and this is actually the artist Zafran, which I talked about earlier. These both continues the fictions and then humanizes the story, which also problematizes it. And so this is kind of this project in a nutshell. I invite you to go out to my Instagram at @LICHTY_art. And thank you for your time. And this is another one of the artists, Vedran Vucic. And once again, this is, once again, an entirely completely constructed fantasy. But once again, as Picasso said, these are lies that reveal the truth, about ourselves as a dim mirror. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was really interesting to see the project explained through the beginning to the final catalogues and then the future catalogue. So excellent work. So yeah, I wonder if anybody has any questions. I think Anna might have left by now. She said she had to get off, but I think LUBA's still here, and obviously Patrick and Mark are still around. So if anybody has any questions, Mark, do you think your work with sentiment analysis will continue into other areas, or do you think this one where you collected up the data and then used it for a project, do you think there's some future works, because you did sound with it in, so you got any future plans?
Nothing concrete, but there's always things in the back of my mind. I think there are a lot of things you can do with that technology. You can have a lot of fun and use it in lots of creative ways. I would like to go back to sound again because I do work with sound, but not very much. But I've done a lot of sound stuff in the past. And again, sound as a medium kind of, when we're talking about emotions, would work, I think, quite well.
Okay.
The actual drone machine project that I did, the reason why I chose as well drones, which is a specific type of music, you know, the whole idea was to create a very introspective environment. In fact, you have to listen to it with headphones. And the idea is really to try and get the person or the people listening to the work into a kind of a very active listening, meditative state almost, getting them back to being attentive, because I feel that's a lot of, you know, attention is something that we've lost a lot of technology. And so yeah, there was I think with sound, yeah, there's a lot of things.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
Well, I had a couple of questions I'd written down before the talks, and actually they have been answered in the talks, but I thought I might share them. So I was interested in understanding how you differentiate a good AI tech demo from good AI art. Now that is a question that I think you would ask any artist who uses technology. Am I looking at the technology being presented in an interesting way, or am I looking at art? And actually the answers that I've picked up from across the talks is that it's the same as any other art form. It's about the ideas of the artist, and it's about the process the artist goes through in constructing their work. And so I feel you've all given me an insight into that, actually, that behind sometimes images that maybe I'm not able to interpret directly, I should be looking at the ideas and processes. And just an observation I would say is, for the curators here, is I can see how important it is that you contextualize and you present that when you present the artworks. Because at the moment, the general arts viewer does not have a high degree of literacy when it comes to understanding AI art. They might have seen Midjourney, it's on the news every night. They have these things in their head, but they need to be taught about what makes good, interesting AI art. So thanks to all the speakers for answering that. And then there was another question, which is, how do artists, curators working in this field engage with the rapid changing nature of their chosen medium, and also the rapid changing nature of the degree of literacy of the viewer? And I think Patrick really said it. I think I got a clear idea from Patrick, which is you acknowledge it and actually you embrace it. So publishing your catalogue before the exhibition is a great way of embracing that and saying, look, it's going to change so much. I need to make a statement now, understand what's going on, because by the time you see the show, things may well have changed.
Well, the other thing about this is that I think is really interesting is the fact that, you know, we have these conceptions that, you know, art is something that belongs in a certain type of museum, you know, under certain constraints. And being that I worked in the contemporary, I worked with Calfe and the Modus and my own group Second Front in Second Life and that sort of thing. And, you know, I remember working with Calfe on RMB City, and she was wondering why people weren't, you know, taking up to it, because it was a serpentine and all that sort of thing. And I said, most of the people in Second Life, you haven't a clue as to what Serpentine Gallery is. You know, in other words, they have their own community, they have their own audience. And I found this is the same case as the NFT space for, you know, now that it's being pulled in and that sort of thing, this is starting to be less so. But, you know, to quote Corey Archangel, an old friend of mine, you know, he was just sort of like saying, you know, that my art world is bigger than your art world. And I think what happens is that we as artists have to consider, you know, the art world is a multiverse, you know, that, you know, with different audiences and sensibilities and contents and forms, you know, to which we have to, you know, look at them as specific contexts to which we have to speak as curators. And to this is that I think this is also very interesting as a theorist and an artist myself, using those discursive tools and flipping them around, you know, then to, you know, use those as creative tools for my own work, I think is really interesting.
And that's interesting. I think another thing that I came aware of is I think it was LUBA who showed the picture that was entered in a photographic exhibition of
Yes.
the two people, someone looking over their shoulder. And when that image entered the news and whatever, a friend of mine who uses a lot of AI tools in her work said, well, you can tell it's an AI image because the hands aren't right. Now, she had sufficient literacy to make that interpretation straight away. That's obviously an AI generated image, whereas the general public at the time didn't have that degree of literacy on the whole, but they will develop it. So not only do the artworks that you create now have to engage with the changing literacy level of the viewer, but you also have to, I think, accept that images made now, in the future, people might look back on them and say, oh, well, that's obviously how that was made. And that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, because that shows that the viewers and the audience are understanding this new way of interpreting images.
Right. I mean, two things is that on one hand, you know, we you know, and we have a giant in algorithm here, Peter Bales. So, you know, thank you for coming. And then so the one thing is that in early work, you know, like some early Frieder Naka work and, you know, and Monar and that sort of thing, you know, it may look simplistic to the, you know, to these days, but the thing is that it's really incredible work, you know, taken into context for the time. And then on the other hand, in regards to what you're talking about, as far as, you know, images that can be seen in a certain way, you know, most of my images of these studios are either a little bit fantastic or actually really quite banal, you know, and, you know, and I think this is where kind of the tension is within them, you know, and then, you know, putting this narrative of the, you know, these narratives of the you know, that I'm trying to pull in, trying to create tension within the AI works. You know, and this kind of activates them, you know, in a bit. Yeah. And I think what happens here is that, you know, a lot of times you have this as you know, as Jeff was talking about, you know, the joy, the visual pleasure, you know, of AI. And I think the second book is going to be kind of getting into that a bit more. But what happens is that, you know, there's this kind of the seduction of AI, you know, it's like you type in something, you get this jolt of visual pleasure, which gives you the serotonin, which brings you back to it. And it, you know, some people are just addicted to this. So anyway,
applies with people using it for text as well, with ChatGPT, you know, that's such a take up because people really like using it, even if they're just making up strange stories or fooling around with it. And there's that kind of ambient use of it, not for the art world at all, just as a hobbyist thing, almost, or amateur art or amateur activity, which will expand. And obviously these places like Midjourney, Night Cafe, they have their own forums and their own communities with their own awards within the platforms, so that some of the work doesn't really get outside, but people become well known and get all that social feedback from their own communities rather than communities outside of. So I think using it in a catalogue context is quite an interesting use of this sort of process where images can just appear, because the whole thing is conceptual, obviously. I'm surprised, are you doing an ebook of it or are you sticking with print for this edition?
What's that?
Well, for your catalog, is it only a print catalog?
Oh, it's going. I'm curious. I would love to take it to the gallery at some point, but what I'm going to do is that it's going to be in the Wrong Biennial as an online exhibition, and so that'll be where that kind of goes. Ben Grosser said this has to be an online.
It's very interesting. Definitely. Great. Excellent. Any more questions from people in the audience?
I'd just like to add one bit that with AI, I see this very much as a parallel. I lived through the very early days of digital photography moving over from analog photography. And it was almost, we used to get students, particularly from the Far East, who were wizards on Photoshop, but the aesthetic and visual stuff that came with it was absolutely dreadful. And it took about 3 or 4 years for digital photography to actually get back some of the aesthetic and craft stuff that analog photography always had. It was almost like photography lost its integrity for a couple of years in parts and then got it back again. And I can see some parallels here. It's not, not with some of the speakers tonight, of course, because I think some of the work that you've shown is stunning. But there is this sort of general thing at the moment that people make visual images because they can, and a lot of them are fairly awful, to be honest. And it will actually come back, and it will actually grow an integrity and a voice of its own, really, in time.
A lot of the images in those sites are sci-fi. I mean, there's fantasy and sci-fi images are probably half or more of the stuff being produced. And then a few others, because in Midjourney, you can watch them in the Discord while you make them. You can see what other people are doing. So you see an awful lot of the same type of imagery. I mean, I thought that one that won an award was immediately obvious as a computer generated image, which means the judges, was it judged or was it voted? LUBA, do you know on that one? That piece that won the award in America, I think it was judged. In which case,
I think there was a jury.
There was a jury. I think that they should know. No, I mean that's not brand new. I mean it'd been around a while when it was put in, so they might have known and just thought they'd award it the prize and get some publicity almost.
I think another. I would call that literacy. Obviously, they didn't have the literacy to make sense of the images because it is changing so quickly. But maybe as a concluding point, because we have gone on quite a while, though it's been a really fascinating evening. I'm glad that everyone's managed to speak for the full length.
Sorry about the overrun, everyone.
Well, the vast majority of people have stayed with us, so that's great. What I would say is it also shows us the importance of artists exploring technology like this. Yes. Because as a society, we try to make sense of AI. We need examples and people challenging us to think about what AI means. Now, if we leave it to the commercial players, we leave it to Google and Facebook, those examples aren't going to be particularly interesting or engaging. It's going to come along and then potentially, as they all keep telling us, it's going to take over. But with artists being involved, we get explorations. We get opportunities to be playful with a new technology, to look at it in a deeper way, to ask questions about it. So I think really for people wanting to understand the risks and the potential of AI, they could do a lot worse than look at what's happening in the art world to get insight into all of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, one last thing is for Sean is that in your larger collection, Catherine Mason has one of my Persian carpets that's a GAN generation from about 1,000 images of different things that I got from my wife in Iran. And the thing is that Catherine has one of my 80 by 60 inch jacquard.
Oh, lovely! Yeah.
So in other words, that's another way we can go with this. I sometimes oil paint these and have them woven and that sort of thing, and by going back into materialization, of form, and basically, using these things as templates for physical work, I think that's another interesting place of discussion.
And of course, that's where the technology has to go. It has to be something that you collaborate with, you work with. You don't delegate your creativity to it. You work with it. Yeah,
great.
I spent 10 years at the beginning of digital photography working hybrid and doing all sorts of things that you couldn't do unless you mixed Photoshop with darkrooms and so on. And I'm just thinking that we could end up with the same sort of thing here with AI, that we use some of the existing technology that we're familiar with, the existing methodologies that we're familiar with now, and we stir a bit of AI into it without just doing pictures that have never gone through a lens or whatever. And there could be a very fun sort of crossover area, that a hybrid area, if you like, that people would benefit from experimenting with, which is, I think, what you were saying.
Right.
Yeah. Fascinating. So maybe to finish, I'd say thanks very much to all the speakers. Thanks very much to Geoff for putting this excellent group together.
Thank you.
And I would also say to particularly the speakers, but anybody here who's interested in submitting to our CAS show, feel free, go to the computerartsociety.com website and consider sending a piece in.
Yep.
Okay,
Great
thank you everybody for giving your talks this evening, all four. So very interesting. And we're maybe seeing the next online talk. I'm not sure what the next online talk is, Sean.
Okay, so the next talk will be it'll be our exhibition, our chat talk at the EVA conference on the 10th of July.
Which is coming up soon, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, please, I can do my plug at this point as the co-chair of EVA. Have a look at the eva.org website. You can find out what we've got in the way of speakers, what we've got in the way of free evening events, and so on and so forth. We've got some very exciting stuff. On the Monday night, there will be a CAS evening with private view of the show that Sean's talking about, and some speakers and so on. And you'll get to meet all our delegates who are international delegates who are coming from all over the world to EVA London. And we've got a lot more people coming in person this year rather than just online, which is exciting. So it's a good chance to network with people and get to know some other people, and have a look at the eva.org site, and I hope to see some of you there.
Great. And this will go up on the CAS YouTube channel within a day or two.
Yeah, and the transcript will probably end up on my site, but I'll let everybody know about that. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, then. Bye.
Bye.